Hi everyone, John here from All Miniatures Great and Small, and today we're going to be continuing our How to Play Flames of War. This time we're moving into more of an advanced part of the rules, and that is artillery. Artillery has its own little chapter in the rule book, and it's an important part of your game. It's one of the three parts of the battlefield. You have your infantry, your armor, and your artillery. And you oftentimes do not want to leave home without artillery, particularly once you start getting more into the game. So I've put out some typical artillery units on the table. Each one of these is a little bit different from the other, but they all have something in common, and that is that they can drop artillery bombardments. Now, just a general aside about artillery. Artillery in World War II was very deadly. It probably accounted for more casualties than any other one particular method of warfare. In Flames of War, artillery is similarly deadly, particularly to infantry and gun teams. Tank teams, not so much. However, there is some artillery that can significantly hurt armored vehicles as well. But it's one of the big differences from the previous version of the game to this version. In version 2 and 3, the firepower of artillery was a lot higher. The anti-tank rating was a lot higher. In previous versions, anti-tank rating was a lot higher for artillery. And in this version, the anti-tank rating has dropped down, but the firepower has gotten better. So artillery has gotten worse against vehicles, against top armor, but it's gotten better in digging out infantry and gun teams and things like that, or enemy artillery, thus kind of cementing its role historically, being more historically accurate. All right. With that said, we have an artillery sequence of play. So anytime you look at an artillery unit, you do a certain number of things. So if you have an artillery unit that wants to fire, you're going to do a couple things. First, you're going to pick a spotting team. So we're going to go ahead and set up with one of our artillery units here and show you how that works. So you're going to pick a spotting team. Now, there are two ways we can spot. One would be spotting with the artillery unit itself. In this case, we are using a 76 millimeter Soviet artillery battery as our example. So any team in that artillery battery can be a spotting team. So if let's say our tree line kind of went out here and it's blocking the line of sight for this guy and this guy, he could still spot and the whole battery could still fire. So you could spot from any one of your teams. Now the downside of that is if you're self-spotting the enemy, they could see you as well. So just keep that in mind. The other thing that can spot would be an observation unit. So here, for example, we have a BA-64OP, or observation post. Certain units can spot for artillery. Typically, it is your formation commander and any unit that has the observer special rule. So here we see observer on the unit card, and on the back it says teams can spot for any friendly artillery unit. So you can use that. Observer is a great way to go if you want to keep your artillery safe. So let's say my artillery is completely behind a tree line, but I do have this observer over here in the tree line that can see that infantry. So that's a way to keep your artillery safe from counter battery fire and just expose your observer post. So those are the primary ways that you can spot for artillery. So you pick a spotting team that's going to spot for this unit. So in this case, I'm going to say, well, my spotting team is going to be my observation post. So there we go. Now, something to keep in mind, who can bombard? Well, any unit can bombard if it has an artillery or salvo line to it. And by that I mean I'm looking at my 76 millimeter artillery card, and here for my 76 millimeter gun, I have an 80-inch range, and it says artillery with the stats, anti-tank and firepower. So I have that. The other thing you might see would be my mid-war Katyushas here have salvo, which means it's going to be a bigger template we're going to place on the board. But salvo is also a type of artillery bombardment. So your unit has to say either artillery or salvo. Now, so that's the first thing you need to do to see if your unit can fire a bombardment. The next thing would be to check to make sure that the unit just isn't pinned down. If the unit's pinned down because it took an artillery hit or took 5 hits in direct fire, if it's pinned down and fails to unpin at the beginning of your turn, it cannot fire an artillery bombardment. The other thing to keep in mind is vehicles can't be pinned down. So if you have a battery of Katyushas, for example, they were American M12 150mm artillery. They can't be pinned down because they're vehicles. So they're they're tank units. So tank units can't be pinned down. So that's one advantage to having armored or self-propelled artillery of some kind, is they can't be pinned down like gun teams can be. The other thing is you can't fire a bombardment if you move. If you can attempt to blitz, but you cannot move and fire. A failed blitz will also prevent you from firing. So failed blitz, no firing. All right. So with that in mind, we've got our unit that can fire because it's not pinned down, it has not moved, and it did not fail a blitz order. So we decided we were going to use our observer post over there, and that observer post is going to place, the next thing we're going to do is an aiming point. So we're going to pick an aiming point for our artillery template. Now, I'm probably going to put it right here to maximize what I'm doing, or the number of teams that I want to try to hit. So I check my card, and if it says artillery, I'm using a 6-inch artillery template. If it says salvo, I'm using, and forgive me, I only have my Team Yankee one handy, a larger 10-inch template. To see what I would hit, I would center that over my range-in marker, and I would point, and it even has an arrow here, so I point back to the battery that's going to fire. So I do have some wiggle room. I could point to that gun or the center gun to see what I could cover. Okay, so that's where I want to try to range in. Then I need to make sure, is this range within 80 inches for my bombardment? Well, yes. I mean, just eyeballing it, I could tell, but if it's close, you want to get your ruler out and take that measurement. Next thing to check out would be danger close. Danger close basically means is I cannot have, when it's this size template, I cannot have any friendly units within 4 inches of that template. If I'm using the large template, I can't be within 6 inches of that template. If I'm using an aircraft to drop a bombardment, which is basically dropping bombs, I can't be within 8 inches of the template. So just keep that in mind. You want to make sure your units, I couldn't have those guys there because they would be too close. Okay, so there we go. I've checked, made sure that there's none of my units that are within the danger close range of my target. So the next thing we want to do is rotate to face if we need to. So let's say if my artillery battery was originally pointed that way, and I wanted to fire a bombardment, well, when I fire the bombardment, I just rotate to face. And really, I just need to rotate so that I'm pointing at one of the units in there. Rotating to face doesn't remove dug in or anything like that. It keeps you where you are. It doesn't count as movement, but it does point your gun battery in the correct direction. Now let's say my artillery battery was this way. Well, that infantry is behind my units except for this back guy. He can see that team completely. So all of my units can actually rotate to face. However, he's the only one that can fire a bombardment because he's the only one who had an enemy unit in his forward firing arc. Okay. All right, so let's assume everyone's within range and all 4 guns can contribute to this bombardment. So the first thing we're going to do is figure out, or range in, and figure out what we need to roll to range in successfully. So typically that is a skill test. So my 76 millimeter artillery battery has a skill of a 4+. So I would need a 4+. But the other thing we need to keep in mind is the skill of my observer. Now my observer has a skill of 3+, which is really nice, but it's not going to help us in this matter, because when we have an observer with a different skill than the artillery battery itself, you use the lower or worse, not the lower, the worse of the 2 ratings. So I'm going to unfortunately just range in on a 4. Every unit that attempts to range in gets 3 attempts to range in. So that observer is going to get 3 attempts to try to range in on this infantry unit. So we know that we need a 4 to range in, because that's the the worst of the 2 skill ratings. So I'm using my 76 millimeters 4+ skill trained. All right, and then there might be some modifiers to this roll. Let's say that the infantry were dug in around woods. So we say our tree line kind of goes like that. Right. If our template covers tall terrain, or let's say there's some stone walls in front of the infantry, short terrain, it's going to be 1 harder to range in. So let's say instead of needing a 4, we now need 1 harder to range in, so we're looking for 5s to range in on our spot. All right, so let's go ahead and try. Here's our first attempt, our second attempt, and our third attempt. Let's imagine on the third attempt we rolled a 6. Okay. So every attempt, our chance to hit our targets gets worse. If we had rolled 3 3s, we would have failed and not even ranged in this turn. But for this example, we got it on the third attempt. All right, so these Germans are normally hit on a 4. For every failed attempt to range in on them, we're going to hit them 1. It's going to be 1 harder to hit them. So instead of a 4, it's going to be a 5 to hit them. It's going to be a 6 to hit them. So for this first round of firing, we're going to need 6s. Now, I look at my template again, and I see it's going to cover 5 teams. So the way to do that correctly is I like to put a die by each team that is going to be hit by that artillery bombardment. Unlike direct fire shooting, there's no swapping of hits or anything like that. So I'm going to need 6s to hit somebody here this round. So I'm going to roll. I missed that guy. I missed that guy. I missed that guy. I missed that guy. And let's say we rolled a 6 for that guy. All right. So we got a hit. So if there's a hit, that unit needs to make a saving throw. So that infantry has a 3-up save. They make their 3-up save. They fail. But because this particular infantry unit is dug in, the firing artillery unit needs to make a firepower roll, which I check here. Firepower is 4+. Because he failed his armor save, I make a firepower roll. And I rolled a 2. I'm rolling really bad in this example. So that means even though the infantry failed their save, because they're dug in, the artillery couldn't get them. So they missed. Otherwise, if they rolled a 5, that unit would be destroyed, or team would be destroyed. If they were not dug in, let's say they just moved out because they're advancing, I don't need to make a firepower test as the artillery unit. A failed save is just a dead infantry team. So you can see digging in your infantry, digging in your gun teams is very important against artillery, because it provides you basically 1 extra roll to survive. Not only do you have to fail your roll, but the artillery needs to make a firepower roll. And a unit like 76 millimeter artillery with a 4 plus firepower means it's only going to get, even if you fail 10 saves, on average, they're only going to get their firepower half of those times, or five times. So digging in can really extend the life of a unit under an artillery bombardment. Now, another way you can do it is the fast way, and say, well, I know there are 5 teams under that template, and they're all the same, so I'm just going to roll 5 dice. And let's say we got a couple of 6s here. And then you could let your opponent decide which guys are dead. A lot of times that's a fast way to do it if there's a lot of teams under there, and it really doesn't matter if it was this guy or this guy or this guy. As the firing person, I don't really care. If you don't care, you can use this fast method. But otherwise, if there's any question, you want to use the individual method. You assign the die, roll it to see if that individual team is hit. You also have to do it if one of your teams is something different. So if this is a Panzerschreck and these are just normal MG teams, well, I could roll these 3 MG teams by themselves and then the Panzerschreck. So only one of these 3 got hit. So there's the fast way, and then there's the more accurate, detailed way. If there's any question, do the detailed way as your default, and only do the fast method if you agree with your opponent beforehand, before you start rolling any dice. It can be very frustrating at a tournament. You shoot an artillery bombardment, and then the other player just rolls his dice real quick, and you haven't decided how it's going to be assigned or anything like that. So you want to make sure if you use the fast method, you discuss it with your opponent beforehand. So the other thing to note is if I range in successfully, that range in marker stays there. If I fail to range in on that point, the range in marker is not there. You don't place it, but you can try again the next turn. Now, one of the interesting things about artillery bombardments is you can repeat a bombardment. Once you've ranged in once, it's a lot easier to hit that spot again. So you don't need to range in again if on turn 2 these guys are firing on that same exact spot. They've got it dialed in, they know where they're firing, so we go straight to hitting the teams that are under the template. And we do that at the team's 2 hit value. These Germans are hit on 4s. There are 5 teams under there, so I hit 2 of them. Now, the opponent, because it's a repeat bombardment, is under more penalties, because these guys are zoned in, they know where they're hitting, they're bombarding everything there. The defender needs to re-roll successful saves on a repeat bombardment. So that can be pretty brutal. So this guy fails, this guy fails, this guy fails, that guy fails, that guy passes. So 4 of the 5 teams failed because I was rolling. I had to re-roll my saves. So I did that, and just in case you have a question, normally you'd say, all right, his save, he passed, re-roll, he passed. Save, pass, re-roll, fails. But it's the same exact thing if you just roll 2 dice and say, if either one of these is a fail, he fails his roll. Same statistics, it doesn't really matter, and again, it's another shortcut to hitting. So with those 4 teams hit, again, I would make firepower checks for each one on a 4+, would result in a dead team. So we hit those front 4 there. And boy, my dice are just terrible. There we go. We killed 2 and we missed 2. Okay. All right. Another thing to note is when you are successfully hit by a bombardment, that unit is pinned down. So on turn 1, it would be pinned down. It would try to unpin on the beginning of turn 2, and so on. But every time you're hit by a bombardment, you place a pin down marker. So that means I might have ranged in, but I missed everyone under the template. They're not hit. Now, if I hit you and you make a save, you were hit. So even though you're saved, no one died, you're still pinned down. And that reflects the kind of the brutal nature of artillery landing on your head. Another modifier that you might encounter is the number of gun teams you have in your firing unit. So let's say this unit has 6 guns instead of 4 guns. Well, if you have 5 or 6 guns, you get to re-roll your attempt to hit your opponent. So if I range in and I need to hit these guys on a 4, I can re-roll my misses. So him still missed. Him took a hit. Him, at least one of these dice has to be 4 or higher. He took a hit. The guy behind him took a hit, and so on. So having 5 or 6 artillery teams firing dramatically improves your chance of hitting a unit in the first, or hitting the enemy in the bombardment. So it's really deadly when a unit of 5 or 6 teams hits and then repeats a bombardment on the next turn, because they're re-rolling their misses, and the infantry would have to re-roll their successful saves, which is very, very scary. Another thing you need to keep in mind is there's a penalty if we lose all those teams to counter battery fire and we just have 2 teams left. Well, now I'm re-rolling my successful hits. If you have 1 or 2 guns, you have to re-roll your successful hits. So now I need to hit him. Both of these dice have to be a hit on a 4+. Hey, I hit him. Him. Oh, I still hit him. Oh, I still hit him. So normally, though, there we go. Even though one's a miss and one's a hit, that would count as a miss because you re-roll your successful hits. So keep in mind that dramatically drops off the number of hits you're going to take in an artillery bombardment. So if you're facing a unit that's just 3 guns, for example, you might want to try to punk out one of those guns. Not only would it pin this unit down, but it would also make it much harder for that unit to successfully hit targets under the template. Next, let's consider firing artillery bombardments at vehicles, because we were talking about infantry. Gun teams work exactly the same as infantry. They take a save, and if they're dug in, you need a firepower test to destroy them. But for vehicles, shooting at vehicles is a little bit different. So, same thing though. I fire, and I place my range in marker, and from there, I do everything the same. So I range in the same way, I roll to hit what's under the template the same way. So if I'm placing my template there, I could, and a lot of times too you can move around and see how you might hit more. So maybe I want to go there, and maybe I want to go here to cover both of these self-propelled artillery pieces and one of the Hetzers. So now what we do is I fire the bombardment and I look at my anti-tank rating. My anti-tank rating is 3 with these guns, which for artillery, for the most part, that's a pretty decent anti-tank rating. Then I compare it to the top armor rating of my vehicles. So anti-tank 3, and we're going to roll top armor 1 for this guy, top armor 0 for these self-propelled artillery pieces. So basically, just like in direct fire, the German player is going to roll a die. So he's got a top armor of 1, and he's going to add a d6. 1 plus 1 is 2. So anti-tank rating of 3, he rolled a 2. So just like in direct fire, he is penetrated. His top is penetrated. So you're going to roll a firepower test to destroy. Next up, these guys have a 0, so we're rolling a die and we're adding a 0. So 0 plus 4 equals 4, which is higher than anti-tank 3, so he bounces his shot. And then the last guy rolls a 1, 0 plus 1 is 1, which is lower than their anti-tank rating. So we've got 2 firepower tests here. So we'll take a firepower rating and we look at our card for our vehicle, which is a very nice 2+ firepower. These are 155 millimeter artillery, so they're just terribly powerful. So 2+, and we blew up the Hetzer, and we blew up the, I guess that's a Lorraine Schlepp, that's self-propelled artillery. So that is a very effective bombardment, and we put smoke on those tanks to denote that. The units aren't pinned down because vehicles can't be pinned down. but that range and marker is there, and I could bombard again the next turn. So that's how artillery units work against vehicles. All right, so hopefully you guys have now a basic understanding of how artillery works in a game of Flames of War. Something we didn't show in detail, though, is something like the Katyushas, again, use that salvo template, which is just ginormous. So, I mean, if I was firing at this artillery park, I could cover so many, all but 2 of those. So, keep that in mind. So, let's talk a little bit about tactical implementation of this. And we're going to start at the beginning of the game. So, the beginning of the game, well, actually, let's scratch that. Let's start in list building. Having artillery in your list means a couple of things. One, if you have artillery in your list, your opponent has to take that into consideration. If you have no artillery templates in your list, there's no reason why I couldn't stack my artillery together like that on deployment. Knowing that your opponent has an artillery template, even if it's just one, means that your opponent more than likely is going to have to spread out his forces. So that if you fire, you're not going to get everybody, maybe 3 at most or something like that. But to limit the effectiveness of your artillery. Now, if your opponent doesn't do that, hey, that's great. But any seasoned Flames of War player or someone now who's watching this video is going to know that if the opponent has the template, you got to keep that in mind, particularly for gun teams and for infantry. You're going to need to spread them out. So list building, I usually try to have at least one piece of artillery in my list. Now, when you're building your list, do you go gun team? Do you do self-propelled artillery? Do you do rockets? Do you do planes? And I showed planes earlier, and I mentioned planes now, but planes are going to have their own video a little bit later in the series on how to use those. But planes can drop bombardments, basically dropping their bombs, just like these guys. Their rules are a little bit different, but the outcome, once you place the templates, the same exact thing. All right, so do you take these, whatever? Well, normally, and this isn't a hard and fast rule, but our gun team artillery is typically going to be cheaper because it's more susceptible to being pinned. It's typically slower. Normally, once you place gun team artillery on the table, that's probably where it's going to stay, unless it's dual-purpose artillery, like some of these Soviet guns you might push up into direct fire if you need to, things like that. Self-propelled artillery, like these M12s, they are more expensive. I mean, they're more expensive because they have a better gun in this example, but on the whole, with the same type of gun, self-propelled artillery is usually going to be more expensive. And the reason why is, obviously, it can't be pinned. It can survive counter battery fire, sometimes better, and it can move farther and faster. So these guys move like a tank. So they move 10 inches in a turn if they're not going to shoot an artillery bombardment. So that's very, very nice. So there is an advantage to that, but you're going to have to spend more points. All right, so once you've decided that, all right, well, I'm taking that or multiples, that's good. I don't recommend like building your force around artillery, because a lot like rock, paper, scissors, artillery is great against infantry and gun teams. Vehicles are great against artillery and so on. So you can kind of imagine how that goes. All right. So in the game, though, when you start the mission, depending on the mission, you might be able to place pre-planned artillery range-in markers. So it might say something like every artillery unit on the board or an ambush, you can place one range-in marker. So when you place a range-in marker, you still have to follow the line of sight rules. You have to be able to see with something, an observer or the gun team itself, where that range-in marker is going to go. I guess technically you could place it somewhere where you can't see, but you can't fire at a marker that you can't see during the game. So keep that in mind. So when you're setting up and deploying, you want to be looking at avenues where you can see into your opponent's deployment zone. Can you get your guns to cover an objective? Can they cover the objective that you're trying to capture with guns? Are you going to be firing a smoke bombardment, which is going to be in a different video where we're going to talk about all kinds of smoke. In that case, you might want to place it where you want to have your smoke line start. So there's a lot of things to consider when you are deploying your army. Another thing to consider is when you deploy, like here, my command team is the guy with the little blue hat, just so I can keep track. Everyone has to deploy within command of the command team when you first set up. So you can't spread your artillery out like you could in previous versions like that. You actually have to be in command when you deploy. During the game, it's all about finding the most high valuable target that will enable you to win your objective. So there might be targets that are, you'd get more guys under the template or potentially inflict more casualties, but you need to look for firing opportunities that are going to help you in whatever goal you're trying to accomplish. Are you planning on attacking that objective on the enemy's left flank? Well, in that case, you might want to range in and start bombarding there and killing those infantry that are dug in on that objective. Are you fighting Germans that have a couple of 88s in the backfield that are just going to murder your tanks if they come forward? Well, maybe you range in on those and start whittling them away, even though you might only get one or two teams under the template. Those are very high value targets that can cause you a lot of problems. So there might be better, more infantry to hit, more people under templates in different spots on the board, but you might want to hit those one or two teams to knock them out. Firing at vehicles is a very iffy proposition. Really, depending on the artillery you're using to fire it at vehicles, tanks, and half-tracks and whatnot, really you're counting on maybe your opponent rolling ones or twos if it's particularly good artillery to even get to that firepower test. So firing at tanks and tank teams isn't really what artillery is meant for in the game. You can do it, and you can do it successfully, like our little example showed, but you really can't count on it because you got to count on it again on them rolling ones or twos depending on what the artillery bombardment is. And then some can't even hurt. Like a 76 millimeter artillery battery has an anti-tank rating of 2. That means vehicles with a top armor of 2 are impervious. You can't hurt them in an artillery bombardment. And normal tanks with a top armor of 1 means, well, they've got to roll a 1 to equal and a 2 or higher to bounce. So you can't even penetrate a top armor 1 tank. The best you could do is bail it out if they roll a 1. So you can see with 76 millimeter artillery, very rarely would you see me or Jake firing that at our opponent's tanks. Sometimes you have to because you're setting up an assault or you're trying to clear an objective or it's the only thing that's going to stop your opponent from rolling onto your objective. Sure, take the shot even if it's a high-risk shot. If you're going to lose otherwise, you might as well take it. But it's something to keep in mind. You want to start whittling down your opponent's infantry and gun teams first because that's the best thing that these things shoot at. But sometimes you've got to take those shots at harder to hit targets to help you win the game. All right, there you go, guys. There's probably a lot more we could talk about. We can continue this discussion down in the comments below. Let me know what you think about artillery, any tips or tricks that you use in building lists and including artillery, or how you use them in game, how you think of them. I really like having artillery. Like I said, at least one artillery unit in any list I build. Some lists might not have it just because artillery can be expensive, but I like always having it to keep my opponent honest. I hope you enjoyed this how to play video on artillery. If you did, please do let me know down in the comments below. Kick us a like and subscribe and click that bell to receive notification when we release new content. You can also, if you like our Flames of War content, check out our Patreon. Their patrons get access to a Flames of War battle report every month that's exclusive to them, and there's a lot of good stuff on there now. So I hope you enjoyed this, and keep on gaming.